I was thinking to myself, what a wonderful voice, Emily. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, it was great fun last week to have Michael Dowd here and his wife, Connie Barlow. He preached the Sunday morning services and provoked a lot of thought, and then spoke at the Center for Faith Studies presentation on Thursday night to a sizable crowd and received a standing ovation. And Melanie and I had the privilege of hosting them throughout the week at our house, and so we also kind of got in on a number of meals and a couple of late-night conversations, and it was great fun. Since 2008, I've really been an appreciator of Michael when he released his second book, which was called Thank God for Evolution. And it really, to me, put him on my radar as one of a growing number of Christians and other people of faith who are increasingly waking up to the fact that in the last 500 years, some stuff has changed. And that maybe we need to be relooking at our faith in light of those changes. And there are a lot of Christians who kind of resist, ever since the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, all of the advancements in technology and so forth, they keep on insisting that science needs to be continually revised in light of theology or our beliefs about God. But Michael is one who insists that no, our beliefs about God need to be revised in light of our growing scientific awareness. And this isn't because Michael believes that science has more authority than God. It's rather because he believes that science has something to say about what reality is about, how the world and the universe works. And if God is in some way connected to reality, then the more we know about reality, the more we know about God, and the more we can live then in right relationship with God. In fact, one of Michael's key points he made both on Sunday and at the Center for Faith Studies lecture is that it's critical for us in the modern world to live according to the 3 R's, in right relationship with reality. In fact, it's important because living in right relationship and reality is actually, in Michael's understanding, the same as living in right relationship with God. That God and reality are one and the same thing. That when we say God, the word God is what a theologian speaks of in describing what scientists would call reality. And the word reality or the universe is is the word that scientists use to describe what a theologian might say is God. Like in Michael's view, God, what we call God, is a personification of reality. Now, I kind of quibbled with him about this yesterday on my deck for about a half an hour. I think that reality is actually a personification of God, meaning that all of reality that we see is a reflection of God's nature and character and will and intent, not the other way around. But in the end, we both knew we were arguing over, like you say potato and I say potato. In our lived experience, it's still the same, that God and reality are bound up with one another, and that right relationship with reality and right relationship with God are the same path. Now, this gets important because it has some rather important implications. For instance, for a lot of Christian history, in particular segments of Christianity that has insisted that you can't be in right relationship with God without having right beliefs about God, this is a very threatening notion. Because if living in right relationship with reality and relationship with God are the same thing, then it is theoretically possible to be an atheist and have no belief in God and still live in right relationship with God. As Philip K. Dick once observed, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Doesn't go away. And so it's quite possible, if you're living in right relationship with reality and have no beliefs or have beliefs in the wrong God or what have you, to still be in right relationship with God. Conversely, it's also possible to have the exact quote-unquote right beliefs about God, believe in the right one and have all the right notions about God, But if you're not living in right relationship with reality, you're not living in right relationship with God. Your beliefs do nothing for you. Now, this idea wasn't invented by Michael Dowd. It's as old as the Bible itself, in fact, particularly in the prophetic literature of the Bible. If you read, about the prophet Samuel and Nathan, or you read the book of Amos or Hosea, or you read Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel, you'll find the same principle passed down throughout the centuries, which is this, that even if you believe in the right God and worship the right God, if you oppress the poor, if you neglect the needs of those who are less fortunate than yourself, if you abuse the weak, if you fail to show compassion towards those who are experiencing the underside of life, it doesn't matter what God you believe in, even the right one, you are serving a false God. Over and over and over, the prophets point this out. There is a definite relationship between God and reality, and living in right relationship with each. So what Michael Dowd thinks has changed since the biblical time is not the notion, but rather our understanding of God. It's reality. It's radically expanded. The ancients lived in a world that was bounded by where the stars and the heavens and the planets revolved around the earth, and the earth was only 6,000 years old. We live in a 15 billion light year wide earth universe, and the earth hardly is the center of it. Time has been a lot longer. We lived in a much more expanded view of the world, a reality, and therefore, theoretically, we should also then have a much better notion of what it means to live in right relationship with God, theoretically. And in some cases, you can certainly see where this works. For instance, take a community in ancient times that may have experienced drought and the subsequent famine that followed. Now, in ancient times, it would not be a given that the neighbors, or the surrounding communities, would help that community who's experiencing famine. Why? Because one of the explanations for why that drought and famine was occurring is because that community had sinned against their God. And so their God was punishing that community. And therefore, if you stepped in to help them, you were actually thwarting the will and intention of God. So they didn't necessarily step in to help out. We, in modern times, know that drought is the product of weather conditions that respond independently of human activity, or at least used to. That's kind of changing too. And yet even now, in light of the fact that we know that human behavior is even changing the weather, we don't associate it with one particular community. We realize it's a collective action that's causing that. So we are much more likely to respond with compassion rather than contempt to someone who's experiencing famine and drought. And likely, therefore, we could say we know something more about how to live in right relationship with God, because we are living more in right relationship with reality. Now, it's easy to get a bit too optimistic about all this, though, as our knowledge of reality, expands. It does not bring with it just this automatic equation, we're now living in much more better relationship with God. I mean, haven't you found, for instance, in your own life, like the more information you have, sometimes it makes it harder to make decisions? Like, don't you just kind of want to throw up your hands someday in light of all the information received like each day and just say, just stop the faucet? like give me 2 pieces of information today, not 2,000. Wouldn't life be a lot clearer and maybe easier in some respects? We are just drenched in information overload. And what we find is the more our knowledge of reality then increases, sometimes it makes our moral decisions even rather ambiguous. It's harder to make up our minds. We're aware of too many arguments on too many sides. And so you just look what's happening, for instance, at the border right now with tens of thousands of children flooding across them from South and Central America. And our response, we're like being really sluggish. Well, any country in human history having received tens of thousands of children would have just instantly grabbed them and welcomed them in and done something for them. But we have a much greater understanding of all the different realities surrounding that situation and the actions and reactions and so forth. And so we like have a harder time finding our way. What's the right thing to do in this? And so sometimes an increase in understanding of reality actually makes it harder, not easier. So what do we do then? I don't know about you, but sometimes I am tempted to just simply like put on the blinders, like just make me aware of this much information, not this much. But when it comes down to it, the world we live in is an increasingly dangerous place. Just the headlines that came into my email folder this last week alone. It's just like, you got Israelis and Palestinians fighting, you got Ukraine and Russia and with the implications for us in this, and you got terrorism, you got all these things that are happening. The world is an incredibly dangerous place, and increasingly so. In a sense, trying to reduce the information we know about the world to make life easier is a bit like wandering out into a minefield saying, I'll be safer if I don't look where I'm going. We actually need more information. While complexity kind of makes our heads hurt, we kind of need that right now. Because if you're walking through a minefield, you kind of need to be aware of a lot of different factors, right? So how do we negotiate the terrain in the modern world with so much complexity? Well, I actually think that some of those ancient principles that come out of the Bible, even though times have changed quite a lot, they apply quite well in the modern world. The way the ancients negotiated kind of these complex territories really shows a lot of promise for us in many respects. There's really kind of three understandings of what reality is about and what God is about that the Bible has that I want to lift up this morning briefly. As ways that we can use in the modern world to negotiate the increasingly complex terrain. The first of which, in our experience of reality, and one thing we have to kind of recognize is just, these headlines suggest that if reality is about anything, at least our lived experience of reality on earth, it's about struggle. Struggle is just inherently part of what it means to be alive on earth. I wish it weren't the case, but you look at throughout human history, we've always struggled. We've always struggled. So anytime we try to eliminate struggle from reality or ignore it, it just doesn't work. And why that's helpful is that a lot of times, you find people proposing, routes through complex situations that promise if you just do this, then our struggles will be over. This helps remind me to say, oh, really? Really? Do you have an adequate grasp of reality here? It also means that as we move forward, that struggle is simply part of the territory of life. To live in right relationship with reality involves struggle, but also to live in right relationship with God involves struggle. And this is, in some respects, should be comforting to us, that just the fact that you and I struggle in life does not necessarily mean that you and I are living outside of right relationship with God. In fact, there's more than enough evidence to suggest that if you the more you live in right relationship with God, the more trouble you're going to get into, the more you will struggle. You just look at Martin Luther King or Jesus, right? So that's the first kind of piece of it that's important to embrace, is actually embrace the fact that reality has to do with struggle. But if that was all reality is, that would be pretty bleak, and so would our relationship with God. The second piece that the Bible lifts up, I think, is well expressed by Paul. Hear Paul's idea of what's central to our experience of reality.
From Paul's letters to the Corinthians, the first letter in the 13th chapter, verses 1 through 8. If I speak in tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I have gained nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. And as for tongues, they will cease. And as for knowledge, it will come to an end. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. The greatest of these is love.
Concept, I mean, that Paul is offering us that really, if you have no love, you basically aren't real, or you're not trading in reality. You have no essential relationship with reality. You have, therefore, no real connection to even the God behind that reality. To me, that's important to bear in mind as well. That when we are offered an array of solutions to complex issues, those solutions that do not involve love in some way are usually the most dangerous ones, are usually the ones that lead us to dead ends. Even though they may look attractive at first, they're the ones that we should be avoiding, that really sometimes, even though a path may seem harder to follow, if it includes love, it is actually the most realistic path, oftentimes even the most safe path. As we look at the struggles in the Ukraine and Russia and bringing us in, or do you look at the Israelis and the Palestinians, what have you, do you really think that either side of those struggles will be safer if either side is less loving? Sometimes we tend to dismiss Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, love your enemies. We say, oh, isn't that nice? He's being so naive. We can't really do that. But in today's world, if we are less loving, are we really safer? Jesus was an incredible realist in this regard. We're finding that more and more so every day. What applies to us, curiously, also applies to God in this respect, to love. If God and love and reality are the same. Several years ago, I think it was the last time Michael Dowd visited, when I was listening to his talk about reality and God and stuff, I actually took, you wondered, well, what if you took what Paul says, you just heard in 1 Corinthians, and you applied it to God? What if you were to replace what God says about you and I and put God in place of that? How would that passage sound? Perhaps you remember when we read it a few years ago. Here's how 1 Corinthians 13 sounds if you put God in place of you and I. If God speaks in the tongues of mortals and of angels but does not have love, God is a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if God has prophetic powers and understands all mysteries and all knowledge, and if God has all faith so as to remove mountains but does not have love, God is nothing. If God gives away all that God has, and if God hands over God's very self so that God may boast but does not have love, God gains nothing. God is patient, God is kind, God is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. God does not insist on God's own way. God is not irritable or resentful. God does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. God bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. God's love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. Now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is God's love. To me, that's a helpful reminder, too, when we struggle and we have our own doubts about our own place in the order of things, to be reminded that if God didn't love us, God's reality would be less, not more. That we can expect that when we face God, we face truly love and respond to that. You notice how some people can have like a really like strong and confident belief in God, but not be very loving? And it's like, what good does your beliefs do you? But some other people can have a very weak and shaky belief in God, or no belief in God at all, and yet be very, very loving as people. Which one would you rather be? Sometimes the presence or absence of love clarifies things pretty fast. It does so with God as well. Well, the third characteristic about reality, besides struggle and love, is actually best expressed through that pencil you were given when you came in. I hope you were given pencils anyway. This wasn't meant to be as a donation to the box for school supplies. There's a message behind the pencil that was best expressed in an essay that was written by an economist in 1958 that was recently redone in video form, revised slightly and shortened, which I offer you now.
This is the world we live in. If we weren't surrounded by it every day, if we didn't take it for granted, we'd be dumbstruck by its very intricacy and brilliance. This is an ordinary, familiar wooden pencil. You might think a pencil is simple. Chances are you've been using one since before you could even read or write. But just because it's familiar doesn't mean it's simple. In fact, it's complicated, elaborate, beautiful, elegant. Its very existence is too improbable for any one person to truly comprehend. These are the basic materials that go into a pencil: graphite, cedar, metal, and rubber. But if you had all the elements of a pencil right in front of you, could you make a pencil? It's not as easy as you might think. In fact, no single person on the face of the earth could do it without the help of countless others. And this is the key to understanding the world. A pencil, just like you and me, is the end result of a vast and intricate family tree, a symphony of human activity that spans the globe. Through their work and knowledge, a vast number of people have had a hand in making this simple pencil. Unlike your family tree, this one begins with an actual tree. The most immediate ancestor of the pencil is a cedar tree in the Pacific Northwest. But the loggers who harvest the timber are also its ancestors. And these men don't work alone. They, in turn, are assisted by the people and industries that produce the saws, rope, and countless other tools that they use. These are also the ancestors of our pencil. As is the waitress at a nearby diner who sells the loggers lunch, to say nothing of the thousands of people involved in producing that simple midday meal. Across time and space, the web grows. Consider the roads, trucks, ships, communication systems, and the people who design, build, and maintain them. All of them are necessary to bring the lumber to the mills and the slat factories that process them. All of them are also the ancestors of the pencil. And even with the work of all these people, so far all we have is a stained wooden slat, a naked half of a wooden body of a pencil. But its family tree is larger and more extensive. The graphite is mined in China and Sri Lanka. At the pencil factory, it's mixed with clay and heat and other materials before it's extruded, dried, and baked in a kiln. People from different continents, different cultures, cooperate to bring these materials together with waxes and kilns and equipment from across the world. These too are the ancestors of the pencil. And the same is true of the eraser. With ingredients from around the world, it's the end result of a similarly complex and exotic branch of the family tree. As is the ferrule, the metal band made from material that is mined, refined, and shipped from all over the world. Each part of the pencil is the result of the collaboration and cooperation of millions of people. Together, they form a process that is constantly changing and adapting. A change in the availability or cost of material from one place might make another source more desirable, and the process changes and adapts fluidly. And there is a fact that's still more astounding: the absence of a mastermind, of anyone dictating these countless actions which bring a pencil into being. Each member of this family tree supplies only a small amount of the necessary know-how needed to make a pencil. They do so voluntarily, not because they necessarily want pencils or like pencils, but because by working to create them, they exchange their labor and skills for the wages that let them buy what they want and need. What you're seeing is the market at work. The spontaneous configuration of creative human energies, of millions of people with their various skills and talents organizing voluntarily in response to human necessity and desire, as if led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of the intention. Every second we are alive, we benefit from the products of voluntary, spontaneous cooperation. This is the modern world. It's miraculous, it's intricate, and it gets better every day, so long as people are free to interact with each other. If we can leave the creative energies of humankind uninhibited, there's no limit to what we can accomplish.
To tell the truth, if I have one of these in my hands, I usually would rather have a pen, unless I'm working on a crossword puzzle. If I'm going to have a pencil, I'd rather have a mechanical pencil. So in my lived experience, this thing is kind of passé. It's not really that useful in my life, and yet that in itself is instructive to me, that oftentimes those things that we think even are not particularly important for our lives, or maybe passé or what have you, or worthless, if you contemplate them just a little bit, the magic opens up, the wonder, just what brings that into your life. Those three principles, struggle, love, and wonder, to me, form the basis of what I consider to be my central experience of reality. That is, an embrace of struggle rather than is more realistic than an avoidance of struggle. And that in the midst of our struggles, those loving solutions are usually the most realistic. They correspond most to reality and also in conformance to our relationship with God. And oftentimes I find that when a loving solution is hard to figure out or hard to find, or I just don't want to find it, when I contemplate the situation to the point where it produces a sense of wonder in me, I'm usually in the best position to make the right decision, to find that loving way, to exist in right relationship with reality, to exist in right relationship with God, to exist in right relationship with my neighbor, and to exist in right relationship with the earth. So that's my take on reality, what it has to do with God. What is reality to you? And what does God have to do with it? Amen.